Hello and welcome to the INET conference in Bretton Woods. I'm with Simon Johnson, Professor at MIT Sloan and the former Chief Economist of the IMF. Now, you have become famous, if one might say infamous, in the last couple of years by speaking out very openly about the shortcomings of the financial system. In terms of what you've heard at this conference this weekend, are you any more confident that the global elite is trying to remake finance, remake economics in a potentially more beneficial way?
No, I don't think the global elite, the people who actually call the shots, are yet moving in that direction. I think, though, that the people at this conference who are, let's say, the intellectuals and analytical people pressing on that elite absolutely do get this message. Too big to fail banks are too big to exist. They need to have a lot more equity financing. Our thinking about capital, for example, coming out of Basel III is completely wrong. We should be pressing towards much higher capital. The kind of capital that Adair Turner and Andrew Haldane from the UK, for example, have been pushing for, 20% or 30%. So that discussion is going on, and that's very helpful and very constructive. But we're a long way from yet turning that into policy.
Well, of course, Adair Turner is going to be speaking at Saturday night dinner, and I imagine that's probably one of the themes he's going to be touching on. But in terms of the too big to fail issue, I mean, it does look as if, from the conversations, that there isn't really much agreement, much progress on that at all. Quite the reverse. I mean, they're almost going backwards and creating more concentration of banks that will require government support, not less.
Yes, and in some countries like the United States, that's true. The bigger banks have actually become bigger. The concentration has increased because of the failure of Bear Stearns and Lehman, and the fact that Merrill Lynch was bought by Bank of America. In some other countries, of course, including Switzerland and the UK, there has been some reduction in the size of the biggest banks relative to GDP. But both those countries still remain extremely vulnerable because the banks are so big. Two banks, 5 times GDP in Switzerland, 6 banks, 5 to 6 times GDP in the United Kingdom. So a few countries have stepped back, and this is the vulnerability is why Switzerland and the UK are thinking hard, at least, about these issues. In the United States, I'm afraid, there's a great deal of complacency and a great deal of refusal by the policy elite to really think hard about this issue.
Now, one of the things that has also come out of the conference is a concern about the nature of economic thought and academic research. Larry Summers pointed out last night that traditional academic economics hasn't had many tools for looking at issues like liquidity and leverage. Do you think there is much of an attempt now in the academic profession to actually get your hands around how to use economics to study the financial system better?
Yes, absolutely. There's a healthy competition between academics in the United States and around the world. If you have a better paper, a better idea, a better model for how to think about these issues, you will become well known and you'll get lots of interesting traction with the public sector and with the private sector. Now, academics take time. Some of these problems are very hard. We don't even yet have, I would say, a workable definition of systemic risk. And I don't know, I talk to people in central banks around the world, I don't know anyone who is within 5 years, I would say, of something, an operational model you can put before the policy level people and say, look, we have to force some banks to downsize or change what they're doing because of the operational measures are way too high. So there's a long way to go, but for sure people are starting to get serious about this at an analytical level.
And do you start to see students coming up and trying to remake the way they approach economics?
Absolutely. Again, the students have every interest to come up with models, to find data, to write papers that will make them famous. And there is certainly a favorable setting for challenging the status quo. This is a big change compared to the pre-2008 situation, for example. If you'd written a paper as a young academic in 2006 saying everything's wrong with derivative markets, I don't think you would have got a lot of traction. Even Raghu Rajan, one of the most famous finance economists in the world, had limited traction in 2005 when he made those points at the big conference in Jackson Hole. Now, it's obvious there's a problem. There can be problems. The question is, how do you deal with them? And how do you weigh the costs versus the benefits of various ways of proceeding with regard to regulating and trading derivatives?
But given it's so hard to translate some of that skepticism into actual official policy at the moment, how concerned are you that the way that the regulation is going to lay the seeds for the next crisis?
Oh, it's definitely laying the seeds for the next crisis. That's clear. The question is, how big a crisis will that be? When will it come? Do we have enough time to make some changes and make the system safer before the next crisis breaks? And there, I don't know. The timing of these events is always very hard. Some people say what we faced in 2008 was a once in 50 years or once in 100 years flood. I don't think that's the right way to think of it. I think the structure of our economies has changed over the past 40 years. We've become more finance dependent, more inclined to rely on these complicated financial instruments, and the political power of the financial sector has increased massively in the United States, and I would suggest in some other countries also. So all of this suggests we had certainly a big storm, but we weakened the levees. And as a result, big storm, weak levees, massive flood. Well, have we strengthened the levees since 2008? No, we haven't. I think the measures that bailed out the system, if anything, further undermine some of our defenses. And now the people I talk to in credit markets are convinced that the very biggest banks in the world are literally too big to fail until they become too big to save. Until you reach an Ireland-type scenario where saving the banks will ruin the state. And I'm afraid increasingly countries are edging their way towards that scenario.
And in terms of this conference, I mean, what's the one big message you'd like to finish with at the end of this weekend? There's one big message to the wider policy-making group.
Capital. I think the official thinking about capital, how much capital is required, how do you think about capital requirements, that official thinking is really fundamentally wrong. And it's a long way from best practice thinking in academic circles. For example, Anat Admati at Stanford University and her colleagues, who are absolutely the who's who of finance, are saying we should have a lot more capital than what we have today. The New York Federal Reserve, this is amazing but true, New York Federal Reserve is relying, at least in part, based on what they show us in the public domain, on a model, a class of models that prior to 2008, the same class of models said that Basel II capital was quote-unquote too high. So now, and of course it turned out to be too low. Now why would you use the same model, the same kind of model subsequently, to determine how much capital you want in banks going forward? It makes no sense. And they need to confront that, and we need to have a constructive, friendly, positive, but forceful conversation about that, not just with the New York Fed, although they're very important, throughout the Federal Reserve System, with the US Treasury, and across the Atlantic.
All right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.